Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Wrestlenomics Radio. I'm Brandon Thurston, broadcasting live and on demand from Buffalo, New York, where today is Sunday, February 26th, 2023. And I am joined today, as usual, by Chris Gullo, who is, he too has been blading his head, and, and the minimalist, Jesse Collings. Hello.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hello, guys. How are you?
I'm good.
How is Buffalo?
It's fun. It was very icy. I had like a. I've never experienced anything like this in all my life living in Buffalo. I had like like a 2 inch thick sheet of ice on my car that I had to. It was a big project to get it off of my car.
It was like a
Friday
shell.
morning. Yeah, the streets were like a skating rink. I did not see this for myself, but I heard people were actually just putting on ice skates and skating across the ice, like going to the park where there's like a big landscape of open what would be grass, but it was covered in
Mhm.
ice, and I heard that people were ice skating on it.
Is it like there's like snow on the ground and then there's ice over the snow?
I don't know how this happened.
The
Because
rain,
that's
like
that
it rained heavily and then ice.
Yeah.
that we had a very it's I wouldn't say it's quite ice skating down the street weather, but we had a lot of ice and we have like some snow on the ground, and that will happen where like it'll become so slick on top of the snow that you can just slide around like it's there's basically ice on top of the snow. I remember it happened once when I was in middle school, and you could go sledding down the hill outside of the middle school with like your backpack. Like you'd put your backpack on your stomach and you'd slide down the hill because of how slick it was. But ice skating to the park is pretty good.
Well, we have a few things to talk about here today. I decided in lieu of any major news subjects, but we had to have some news subjects to go through. We'll talk a little bit about the WWE Performance Center and look at some data analysis that I was doing around talent and how many PLE matches they've had and what their experience was before they came to WWE. So we'll get to that. And if you want to participate today with any of your questions or comments, feel free, if you're watching live through YouTube, to submit a super chat. One of the stories, though, that was in the news this week was from Fightful about a senior vice president who left WWE, very much along the lines of talent development. And that is, ooh, there we go. And that is, this is a report from Fightful from Sean Ross Sapp. He reported that Senior Vice President of Talent Operations and Strategy, James Kimball, has been terminated from the company. Sean Ross Sapp reported that it was due to a HR, a relations, human resources violation that caused his immediate termination, although no further details of the violation are known yet. Kimball previously worked with UFC. He spent nearly 10 years there. He was the vice president of operations at the UFC Performance Institute. He joined WWE in 2020. He was heavily involved in the NIL, Next in Line program, with recruitment of college athletes for the W Performance Center. He was a key figure in the Campus Rush initiative and their W's partnership with Exos. So I'm reading partly from a report of that news from John Pollock, originally reported by Fightful. And then Sean Ross Sapp had a follow up later on. It was noted to Fightful that the HR violation terminology is fairly broad. Could mean that no one else was directly affected, but it wasn't confirmed to Fightful what it meant beyond that. Yeah, a lot of people were surprised by this news. So that's in the news. I mean, this is somebody who joined WWE, as we said, in 2020. He's very involved in a lot of the changes that we've seen to WWE's approach to recruiting talent, in terms of going after college athletes again with a less of a focus on people with wrestling experience.
In the NIL, I mean that is one of the major things that WWE pushes at the kind of the corporate level. They love to talk about it. It comes up pretty much on every investor's call, at least somewhat. Um, they like to work with the media on covering it. I know The Athletic has had stories about the NIL. I think it was Cameron Hawkins wrote a long article for The Ringer. I think it came out like 2 weeks ago about um, the NIL deal, and he I think quotes Kimball extensively in it as like kind of like the main executive that's kind of running this. He goes to he went to like a dinner where they have a meeting with like a lot of prospective NIL athletes and college athletes that might be interested in considering WWE. And Kimball's kind of like the main WWE executive that's there talking to these athletes. So he's a pretty big figure behind the scenes. He wasn't there for a super long time, but again, like as you mentioned, like HR violation could mean a lot of different things. But so I don't want to speculate like a ton, but you look at WWE's backstage atmosphere. You have Vince McMahon and John Laurinaitis, two executives with the company who had to resign or were fired, or however you want to describe what happened with Vince, for what could be described as HR violations. We know more information about what those guys were doing, but that could also be described as HR violations. So those are two executives. Here's a third executive getting fired. Sounds like it was a pretty quick process, at least from what we heard. Again, for an HR violation. You also have people like Jamie Horowitz, who are in WWE, who have lost previous jobs in entertainment due to what could be described as HR violations. So I do think it's relevant to point out that there are multiple executives within this company that have been fired or terminated or retired because they thought they were too old, only to come back 6 months later because of HR violations. And I think this is something that I would hope that someone would ask Triple H about next time he's in front of the media.
Yeah, for background, Jamie Horowitz is now the Executive Vice President of Development and Digital for WWE. He was fired from Fox Sports in 2017 amid sexual harassment allegations.
He was a pretty big figure in sports media. I think before that he developed, I want to say, First Take with ESPN, and kind of played a pivotal role in shifting how ESPN presents like on-air talent and the shows that they would kind of produce. So he was a really big guy when it came to sports television production before he was fired, and he's been with WWE I think for like a year or two now.
So we'll go on to another story. The AEW announced the big announcement on Wednesday, another big announcement from Tony Khan, that there's going to be a new unscripted series, which is code for reality show. AEW All Access is going to be a unscripted show. We don't know the time slot. I assume it's going to start airing whenever Power Slap ends up wrapping up Wednesday night on TBS at 10, I would expect. Don't know that for sure. But there was a press release that came out on Wednesday night that said that, what does it say exactly here? From Jason Sarlanis, who is the president of Turner Networks ID and HLN. He says, quote, AEW has such an amazingly loyal and dedicated fan base that brings in more than 4 million viewers to TBS every Wednesday night, which was a surprise to many people who know that AEW averages around 900,000, sometimes gets as high as 1 million. It was over 1 million this past Wednesday, averaged minute by minute. So we asked Warner Brothers Discovery about the comment from executive Jason Sarlanis. How is that calculated? How did we get to 4 million viewers, knowing that the viewership that we get reported from Showbuzz Daily and from Wrestlenomics is 1 million at best? And they told us that it actually that number is a 1 minute unique viewer count, not just from 8 to 10 when Dynamite airs, but from 7 all the way to midnight. So we're talking about the 1 hour before Dynamite on Wednesday, and then the 2 hours after, counting up the number of unique viewers throughout that entire duration. So that's well different from the usual calculation that we get about viewership. And
I heard that they were. Someone said that they were using McMath to come up with that 4 million number. Were they counting all of like the backstage personnel and the ushers and the ticket takers in that
ushers and ticket takers and hot dog sellers and things of that nature? Yes.
Many of those people were in the Silverdome that day.
They did give me a comment saying that we attribute most of that success to AEW Dynamite.
Right. Well, like within the context of how they use that information, right? This is a press release talking about a new show that is coming to, TBS's Wednesday night block of programming. So they used a figure from what they get for viewers during Wednesday night's block of programming, which is more than just Dynamite. It's, obviously someone watching The Big Bang Theory at 7 p.m. and then turning it off at 7:30 is not a Dynamite viewer. But the context here and the way they used it, like it's a press release, so it's got some numbers to fluff it up. But I wasn't like confused by this the way other people were. I just assumed like, okay, like they're adding a new show on Wednesday night, and this is how many viewers they have for Wednesday night programming. It didn't say it's how many viewers they have for Dynamite specifically. We know what that number is.
Right. Certainly in the world of Twitter and ratings discourse, something like this sends some people into some paranoid reactions about, is this a big exaggeration of you're trying to tell us that the number is actually 4 times what we know it is. I think there's an interesting way to look at this that will actually be informative, and we have a chart that we're going to talk about in a moment. But I think it sounds like somebody said, give me the biggest number you can find, and we'll reference that. It reminds me of a time, I think, when Jesse, when you were requesting media access at an event, and I gave you like some numbers to tell the people how big our reach was, and I gave you like, the Twitter accounts get 4 million impressions per month, and it's like, what? That's the biggest number that I can give you.
Right. Yeah. No. I was applying for one a few months ago, and they wanted to know how many like views per month our news coverage gets, and what I was kind of told to do was just find like the biggest number you could credibly link back to yourself. And so I don't really I work for USA Today's network. I don't really work for the USA Today publication, but I went to USA Network and I just looked at what the biggest number we have for USA Network page views is, which is an enormous number. It's like 250 million page views per week or some crazy loony big number or something like that. I was like, yep, that's how many we get. So I think everyone does that. I mean, it's like I said, this is a press release. This is a good media. This is also like a good media literacy test. Like, this is a press release coming from a network. They are going to use the biggest number that they can try to twist and credibly bring back to themselves to talk about how successful they are. We don't need to. When you read something like that, you need to have that understanding that this is where it's coming from. It's a press release written by someone whose professional job it is to make the company look as good as possible.
Yeah. And
do you think this? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna ask, do you think this is a good sign for AEW and the fact that Warner Brothers Discovery likes bragging about them, that they'll probably bid very well in the TV rights?
I think more so the fact that they're doing this show, All Access, is more meaningful than the words, right? That this is an action, a new show that we're going to give you. It's 1 hour. I don't know how many episodes it will be. Roads to the Top, which this seems like a replacement for that first season. I think it was only like 6 episodes or so. So I don't know if it's going to be any longer than that. But that's an action. That's a real investment of TV time and maybe other expenses that are involved.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Warner Brothers Discovery would love to have AEW Dynamite on its network for as long as they can see in the future. I think that's pretty clear. The whole thing about like the bidding and stuff like that's going to come down to how many other parties are interested in it, and does that impact the price? If Warner Bros. Discovery is the only real major cable network interested in Dynamite and Rampage and whatever else Tony wants to package into that, then the number is not going to be probably as high as it would be if there's 4 or 5 other people or even 2 or 3 other parties that are interested in making big bids. But I think it does, for whatever baseless criticisms out there that Warner Bros. Discovery doesn't like AEW Dynamite and is looking to shed itself from, potentially isn't interested in renewing. I think this is obvious evidence that they're interested in it. I wanted to talk about like the show itself a little bit. We didn't get a trailer for it, which is kind of interesting because it's debuting in a couple of weeks. Um, but to my knowledge, we haven't really seen any actual content from this show yet.
Not that I know of, no.
And so I really wonder what it is going to do. To me, this is all this stuff is okay. Is it roads to the top? Is it total divas or something like that? This all seems like Drive to Survive for me, which is Formula One racing got a huge increase in popularity in the United States. Most people credit it to the success of a Netflix docu-series that just follows around the drivers and some of the key personnel, and a lot, throughout the course of an F1 season. I've never watched the show before, but it seemed to be pretty popular on Netflix, and we noticed that it had a very strong impact on increasing, viewership, particularly 18 to 49 viewership for F1 races in the United States.
And we can see here on the screen, if you're watching on YouTube, we're just looking at Google Trends. You can see this pretty decisive increase in web search, at least, surrounding Formula One beginning around mid 2021, which I imagine is when Drive to Survive began to air.
And it led to a really big increase in its
TV rights fees.
TV rights fees, which I'm sure that's what AEW is interested in. So, and you've seen basically every other, I haven't really seen any of the major sports leagues like the NFL or the NBA or the MLB.
The NFL is doing it. So they mic'd up, I guess, Patrick Mahomes, Kirk Cousins, and Marcus Mariota all season long, and they're doing a Netflix docu-series that they're going to put out about
so
that.
there you go. NFL's doing it.
And the PGA Tour just released it. It's been on Netflix. So
yeah. PGA Tour has done it. NASCAR has dabbled it during certain things. And this is something that I think the idea is to take your personalities and the real people behind these characters and present them to the public in a way that might get new people invested in the show that otherwise weren't watching. And so I think it would almost be better if this show was on not after Dynamite. It's probably better for the ratings in general that it's going to have Dynamite as a lead-in, because you're obviously getting people who are already invested in AEW to tune in. But as far as like making new fans, it would almost be a more interesting show to put on some other night of the week in a time slot where people might stumble across it that don't know that much about AEW.
Yeah, but I mean, Adam Cole was on WWE TV, but it was mostly NXT. I feel like if you're going in that, you need somebody like Sting or Mark Henry, or somebody that the common wrestling audience is, familiar with. Jericho.
Adam Cole's not a big enough star for Chris Gullo, is what he's saying. That's what he's saying here.
No, Gullo's making a good point in the sense. And they very well, I don't know if they were mentioned, but they very well could have. Sting would, I think, be a pretty compelling figure to put on a show like this. I don't know if he's interested in doing that, but there's nothing stopping them from making him and the last year of his career or whatever a key point of the show. And definitely,
you know what would be great is Discovery is the owner of HGTV, right? What if you had a reality show following Real Estate Steve and just following his business, his real estate business, and watching Sting sell some houses? I think that would be compelling television.
Listen, Little John remodels people's basements on HGTV, so it could definitely work.
Can we get Orange Cassidy's life as an architect as well?
Yes. But anyway, this comment in the press release about 4 million viewers, when we know that AEW does like 900,000 or 1 million, it reminds me of some discussions I've had with people over the last, I don't know, year or so, including one conversation I had with my mother where I was trying to explain to her that, like, well, sometimes people think I'm biased in my reporting, and she's like, well, it's just numbers. You're just reporting numbers. Like, how can you're just reporting what the facts are? And this is maybe a kind of extreme example here in this press release with this comment, but you decide how to measure it, and even something like a Nielsen rating is not there are multiple ways to measure a Nielsen rating, and the numbers that we talk about and that Showbiz Daily reports and that we report is a minute by minute average. So it's a 120-minute show, and every minute has a value of the number of viewers who are watching during that minute. You just average them up together, and you get, for example, 1,028,000, which is the number that we got on Wednesday for Dynamite. And then there's this scope of, well, that number is really referring to is just live and same day. So anybody who watches it live while it's happening or on DVR before some cutoff time like 2 a.m., that's what live and same day means in that case. But what this number probably is the unique number of viewers, not only 8 to 10, but 7 to midnight, and probably not live same day, probably live plus 7. So anybody who watches within 7 days. So I just thought it was a good example of how we do have to make a lot of decisions here about how to present this data and how to present it in a way that hopefully is informative and fair.
Right. Anyone that's followed politics understands that you can have the same figure and you can represent that figure in various different ways depending on what your political allegiance is and who you're trying to make look good or who you're trying to make look bad. So it's definitely not all, oh, these are the hard data. This is the hard facts. You can't dispute them. That's a key component of what we do here at Wrestlenomics, but also what everyone in media is trying to do all the time.
But I do think there's at least one insightful way to look at this data. And what we're looking at here, I just put a chart up on the screen for people watching on YouTube, is the number of people who watched at least 1 minute on a weekly average. So this is not 1 minute. This is year to date. So from January 1st to the present, how many unique viewers these shows do on average for at least 1 minute. So the question is, how many people watch at least 1 minute of SmackDown or Raw or Dynamite or NXT or Rampage? How many people watch at least 1 minute, not just live the same day, but live plus 7? So 1 minute is a very low threshold. We would like to, I think it would be fairer to look at a higher minute threshold, maybe like 6 minutes, maybe like 5 minutes or something like that. But anyway, this is what we got. This is Nielsen data. And this is on average year to date. How many people are at least turning the show on? This could include accidental viewership, but how many people are at least turning the show on? And the answer is, for SmackDown, it's 6.8 million. For Raw, it's 4.8 million. I guess SmackDown's really 6.9 million. I'm doing some mental rounding here. For Dynamite, it's 2.9 million. So that's almost 3 million. It's not 4 million, but it's almost 3 million. For NXT, it's just about 2 million. And for Rampage, it's about 1.25 million. So about 1.25 million for Rampage. And I think this gives you an idea of, like, with probably some embellishment because we have such a low threshold, but it's probably pretty close to the number of people who could be watching the show, I guess. When we talk about like how many wrestling fans there are, how many wrestling fans are capturable. For each one of these programs, I would say it's a number lower than this because our threshold is so low. But I think it's close to this, I guess. Maybe it gives you an idea, too, of how partial the viewership is. By that, I mean the extent to which viewers are not watching the entire show. We know SmackDown does it looks like it did about 2.4 million viewers this past Friday, but it's averaging almost 7 million people tuning in for at least some of it. That's almost a quarter. Well, it's still like a third, something in the range of a third. And I think most of these numbers are about a third. You have to multiply their minute-by-minute average by about 3 times to get this 1 minute unique viewer count. And we did have I don't have the chart here, but we did have a chart on our Thursday podcast for subscribers showing the number of unique viewers who watched any WWE show. So we're ruling out people who watch both SmackDown and Raw. They only get counted once, right? And it's something like 10 million people watch any of these 3 WWE shows. And I believe it's something like 3.5 or so million people who watch either of the WWE shows. I think it just gives you an idea of how big those potential audiences are.
Realistically, like if you look at the differences between SmackDown, Raw, Dynamite, NXT, and Rampage using this figure, they seem at least just eyeballing it, they seem pretty close to the differences they have under like the Nielsen data for what we see on the ratings when they come out the
Yeah,
day
I
after.
haven't done the math, but it seems pretty proportionate.
SmackDown seems to be maybe have a larger gap between like SmackDown and Raw in total viewers than the normal total viewer number that we see. That's probably a symptom of SmackDown just being on broadcast television, and people. SmackDown has things like people tuning in for local newscasts 1 minute before the local newscast takes off, and they're watching a minute of SmackDown. Um, so in that regard, but it does seem like, as far as like we're talking about like credible data, if we wanted to report on this, this was what we saw on 4 o'clock Eastern time the day after shows. It still seems to be like the gap would be about the gaps between the shows seem to be about the same. It doesn't seem like one show is secretly doing a lot more people watching 1 minute than another show is. It seems like they all are getting inflated viewership totals. And this includes like people who DVR'd the show, right? Like this the live
Plus seven. Plus seven, yeah.
And if you're DVRing a show, we're 99% of people who are DVRing and have to have watched more than 1 minute of the show.
I would think so, yeah.
Because why would you even open it up if you're only going to watch a minute of it? But yeah, that's just generally my takeaway. I think the SmackDown number is obviously really big. The Rampage number seems kind of small, but that also kind of makes sense because of its time slot. It's much more likely to have people, just wanting to watch Rampage as opposed to people flipping through channels at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, or people. I don't know what the lead in for what's the lead in for Rampage normally.
I don't know.
Is it a movie?
We could look that up on the TNT schedule.
I feel like it's probably a movie.
It's usually
right?
a movie, because I think isn't like Tony Khan often tweeting about whatever movie is on and get ready for Rampage.
Well, it used to do that before they switched to. It used to be The Accountant. The Accountant was on like half of the time before Dynamite.
Yes.
But like it also goes to show, like, from my experience, like
this Friday it's going to be Godzilla versus Kong at 7:30 before Rampage.
Yeah, I definitely watch the final 2 minutes of a lot of Big Bang Theory episodes because I'm popping it on before Dynamite starts. I've seen a lot of sitcom resolutions for Sheldon Cooper and Friends without watching the plot of any of the episode beforehand. So I'm definitely counting in the 1 minute viewer skew for Big Bang Theory reruns.
And by the way, this is all U.S., of course. So does this give us an idea of like how many wrestling fans there are? Again, 1 minute is not the ideal threshold here.
I think you can't with the 1 minute. I think just, especially for like a show like SmackDown, which is going to have so much stuff on before and after SmackDown, that's going to get a lot of views.
But can you knock off 25% of this, or some sort of taper this down a bit? But do we get some idea of like maybe there's 4 million wrestling, at least WWE fans, let's say WWE susceptible wrestling fans, maybe there's like 4 million of those, maybe there's like 1.5 million AEW susceptible fans. I mean, I'm sort of assuming that we all have agreed upon understanding or assumption about what it means to be a wrestling fan. But like, I mean, this gives you an idea of, and this is linear, of course. So we got the problem of not accounting for people who don't tend to use linear TV. But this is a deeper look into it than just looking at straightforward minute by minute viewership would, I think.
I mean, I think it's possibly. I mean, we talk about that sometimes when, especially, this is more the case at WWE because they're more likely to do a show like this. But for certain special shows that WWE does, like the Raw 1000 show or the SmackDown debut on Fox or something like that, we use that number as like, okay, here is the number of, like, Raw 1000 is a good one because that did a monster rating. I think, what did that do? Like a 0.70 on 1849, right?
That was that 2012?
Oh, not Raw 1000.
You're
Raw
talking
30.
about Raw 30.
Yeah, I'm talking about Raw 30.
I will look it up.
Raw 1000 is probably another good example of it, but Raw 30 is much more recent.
Yeah, Raw 30, which was January 23rd, if I'm looking at the right number, did 2.34 million viewers.
And what did it do in 1849?
And 908 1,000 viewers at 0.70 in the demo.
Yeah. So it did this huge demo number. That to me is like more of a sign of like, okay, this is what Raw maybe could potentially do if it took all of its potential weekly viewers and got them to watch for the most part. I think the 1 minute data thing, there's just too much noise with that. Um, Obviously, if you move the threshold up, is that your potential audience? For sure, but if you never get that potential audience for a substantial period of time, like to use SmackDown right here, 6.8 million viewers, that they've never been able to get any number even close to that on SmackDown on Fox. Even the debut, even the show right after football wasn't even close to that number.
So the debut on Fox, October 4th, granted this is 2019, so this is several years ago, a few years ago, 3,888,000, so 3.888 million viewers. It did a, get ready for this, it did a 1.37 in the demo. It did 1.8 million viewers in the demo. 1.37. Wow. So that's like double what Raw 30 did. In the demo
and that was
alone.
with The Rock, and that was the big after a huge media push for debuting SmackDown on Fox, and but even that number isn't even close to what this P2 is, and I'm sure the P2 in 2019, this figure right here, this P2 weekly unique reach 1 minute in 2019 was way higher than 6.8 million, probably, right?
I think yes.
But since then, we're never really getting close to that with any measure we use to what I would describe as like realistic actual viewership as opposed to someone watching 1 minute. It's probably infeasible to think that number is like an attainable audience that SmackDown could have for 2 hours, barring a huge increase in popularity in general.
Yes. So just a quick plug for the Wrestlenomics Patreon at patreon.com/Wrestlenomics. This is where I had a report on Wrestlenomics.com, actually viewable for everybody. But behind the paywall, there is my weekly TV ratings reports for all of the shows, all the WEAW shows, as well as Impact New Japan. It's where the WoW ratings are coming from. The MLW, episode 3 of MLW, as well as the Wrestlenomics 30 episode that Gullo and I did on Thursday afternoon. You get access to the big viewership spreadsheet that I was just referencing to find the SmackDown and the Raw number there, as well as the slides to this podcast. And by the way, if you do have a question or comment, you can put a super chat in if you're watching live on YouTube. But we will now go to our main event topic here. Is how successful is the WWE Performance Center? And to try to answer this, I know we have many intuitions about this, which we will touch on, but to try to answer this in some sort of subjective way or some sort of objective way, I want to look at, first of all, I want to consider, well, when did the WWE Performance Center open? It opened on July 11th, 2013. I think Rick Scott was there when he was governor of Florida, and they opened up the Performance Center in Orlando. And as a stand-in, I guess, for success, how much is WWE actually putting this talent to use, who they've developed through the Performance Center? I want to look at a period after that date, and I want to look at how many wrestlers have actually had pay-per-view / premium live event matches, and did they get their training, the majority of their training or all of their training from the Performance Center, or did they come into WWE with experience from outside of the WWE world? So what I did was I broke down these wrestlers who came in after July 2013, and I did this based on cage match data. It's not easy to. What we could do is go through all those photos and say who's this and track all of those people. But what I did was I used cage match data basically to qualify people as, did you have 10 matches in WWE? If you had 10 matches in WWE, we're including you. So what doesn't get included here, to be clear, are people who may have been signed by WWE, were trained in the Performance Center, and just never had a match before they were cut or something like that. I'm not accounting for those people here. So that is one potential weakness of this analysis we're about to go through. But anyway, I broke talent.
Well, and cage match also is unlikely to have a lot of people's early career data.
I think that's more minor because of the distinctions I'm about to explain here. So I counted you as a pure PC project if you had anywhere between 0 and 19 non-WWE matches before your first main roster PLE match. I counted you as this language may be problematic, but I counted you as an outsider if you had greater than or equal to 100 non-WWE matches before your first PLE. And then there's this middle category, which we'll get into, which may be debatable. And I counted you as mixed if you had between 20 and 100 non-WWE matches before your first PLE.
Are you counting the NXT like takeovers and stuff as PLEs?
No, main roster only.
Just main roster.
Main roster only.
Well, but even like my point with cage matches, like in cage match, will be the first to admit this, that like someone who's just starting out, like their first match is kind of, depending on where it is, but most likely it's at a small indie show, is not necessarily going to be calculated on cage match, because it might be on an indie that isn't in cage match's database. They might be using a name that isn't connected with them later in their career. I think wrestlers will admit, I don't know, Brandon, if your cage match is a testament to this, there's not, all of their matches are not on cage match.
I noticed that cage matches, if the promotion doesn't put results out anywhere, then usually they're not on cage match. So at least, even if the promotion's small, if they put something on their Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, it gets on cage match.
Yes, and and we've talked to the director of cage match before on this program, and he said, a lot of it is it's all volunteer based, and a lot of it is people sending them results, people finding results online and putting it into the system themselves. So I think it's an important qualifier to at least put in place when it comes to.
But my point is like that affects wrestlers, if not consistently, then randomly, right? It's not as if this is affecting a particular population within the wrestlers that we're looking at more so than others.
Probably the mixed figure or the pure figure, if they've only wrestled, the cage match only has them for 10 matches outside of before WWE, I would wager that they probably did have more than 10 matches at some point. It was just at a very early stage in their career, perhaps in a small promotion that wasn't recognized by cage match, perhaps by a different name, and they haven't connected the current WWE performer to what they were originally debuted as. I think cage match doesn't even put profiles up until you hit a certain number of matches.
Yeah.
I would I can't go through each case and point out like, oh, this person actually had more matches because I know this for a fact. But I think it's just something to keep in mind that the cage match data online is incomplete.
Yes. It's an arbitrary qualifier. Like, I guess I could lower the number.
Yeah, and I don't want to, the general sense of your exercise is totally valid, right? What we're looking at here, which is we're looking at people who had we know for a fact had no experience outside of WWE. We know people that maybe had a very short stint working independents outside of WWE. And then we know people who had very long established careers before working WWE. Those people we can pretty much all point out.
Okay. Well, here are the people that we're talking about in their respective categories. So what we're looking at now are a bunch of tables in the three categories: pure, mixed, and outsider. And we're looking at everybody that had at least 4 PLE matches. So what we have here, these are sorted by who had the most PLE matches. And in the pure category, the leader is Charlotte Flair, who had no matches outside the WWE system ever to this day, I believe. Braun Strowman, certainly before. He did not have any, before he was released for a time, he did not have any non-WWE matches. Baron Corbin, Alexa Bliss, Miro, who's debatable. He had a few, but he had, by my measure here, in the cage match and complete data, less than 20. Carmella, Lana, Nia Jax, Liv Morgan, Bianca Belair, Ronda Rousey, Omos, Dana Brooke, Montez Ford, the list goes on. The mixed category, where there will be the most ambiguity. Number 1 is Becky Lynch, who had a longer career in her initial run before she took a break from wrestling. Bayley is counted as in the category in between mixed. Mercedes Moné, we're using modern cage match what I call default names here rather than their true WWE names. Sasha Banks, Eric Redbeard, who was what's Eric Rowan. Rhea Ripley is counted as in between because she had less than 100 cage matches, but more than 20. And that's true for all these people in the mixed category. Shayna Baszler, Elias, Chad Gable, Buddy Matthews, Breezes is Tyler Breeze, Peyton Royce, Dax Harwood, his partner, FTR Hare does make it over the threshold into the outsider category. Anyway, the list goes on. And then in the outsider category, the leader there for the most PLE matches is AJ Styles, followed by Kevin Owens, Xavier Woods, Sami Zayn, Asuka, Brody Lee, Finn Balor, Shinsuke Nakamura, Samoa Joe, Carl Anderson. The list goes on.
Did AJ Styles have a prominent career before he came to WWE? JBL said he was a rookie.
I've heard he's done. He might have done amateur wrestling, I think.
Oh, okay, that makes a little more sense. But JBL told me he was a rookie when he was first made his WWE debut. So I assumed he hadn't had any real experience before.
The Red Hot. It was. Didn't they had like some
the
sort
redneck rookie? It was a very bad nickname.
That's right. Didn't he try to like brand him as the Pitbull or something like that?
JBL is just the absolute worst. I know he's the voice of Vince, but he was between that and him always referring to Daniel Bryan as a farm animal, were like just totally egregious moments of commentary.
Okay. So what I got here is I've got 317 wrestlers who meet this criteria. They've had at least. They had their first WWE match after the Performance Center opened on July 11th, 2013. So they had their first match after the PC opened, right? We're not dealing with Roman Reigns here, right? Who had his first W match before the PC opened. He was on the main roster before the PC opened. So we're not talking about Seth Rollins and Roman Reigns and people of that generation. These are people who had at least 10 matches, which is a stand-in for you're under WWE contract. Which will not be true perhaps in 100% of the cases because I don't have a great database of contract dates and things like that. But you had at least 10 WWE matches, and that's meant to exclude people who had enhancement matches. They had one-offs. This will exclude celebrity guest appearances like Pat McAfee, things like that. And you had your first WTV PPV win more than 9 months ago, which is meant to prevent us from evaluating people who are very new to the system as of this day, right? If you were just signed by WWE 3 months ago, probably not fair yet to evaluate whether or not you've been to a PLE match because you just haven't had a lot of time to develop in the system. So what we get here are some non-intuitive results, I think, among probably people listening, in that it looks very even. These three categories perform very evenly in terms of I've broken it down into three different results. So I asked how many of these wrestlers across the three categories, how many of these wrestlers have had no PLE matches to this day? How many have had between 1 and 4, and how many have had more than 5? And whether you came to W with lots of experience and you're called an outsider, whether you're called pure or whether you're called a mixed, the outsiders do have the lowest percentage of no matches on a PLE, and the pure and mixed are pretty similar. So basically, what we've got is 23% of the outsider category have had more than 5. But also 24% of the pure category have had more than 5 PLE matches. The mixed have had 23%. The outsider category does do better here in the category of who's had more than 1, who's had more than 0, but not more than 5, 1 to 4. They are the most populous category, the outsider category. It's 176 wrestlers. 55% of them have never made it to a PLE match. But you look at the pure PC projects, there's 98 of those. Now, this is only people who actually had matches, not including the people who may have been signed and never had matches or had very, very few. There's 98 of those. 63% of them never made it to a PLE, main roster PLE. 12% of them had 1 to 4 PLE matches, and 24% of them had more than 5. And the mixed is right on par with what the pure level does. So my takeaway from this is I can't say here, at least in this analysis, maybe I could torture this data more and get a more intuitive answer for what I assume is the majority of our listeners' intuition, that, and I'm going to make an argument here that I'm kind of agreeing with that intuition, but that I can't make an argument here that, hey, look, signing all these people up who don't have wrestling experience doesn't lead to great results. I can't say that based on this data. I can't say objectively, look, even in your own usage of this talent, you're not getting them to the biggest events in your company. You are. You're getting them there nearly as efficiently as you're getting people who come to your company with wrestling experience. You are recruiting, at least over the course of this time course from 2013 forward, you are recruiting disproportionately people who have wrestling experience already. Is this believable?
Yeah, I mean, you can't dispute the data that they have. I mean, would you expect that the talent that gets called up to the main roster, which is kind of like a
and I can't dismiss self-fulfilling prophecy here. If there's a motivation to validate this recruitment philosophy into the content of your show, I can't rule that out.
Yeah, well, to me, it's, if you go back to the what we're looking at here is with these numbers, like, okay, not even like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but just in the sense of, like, if you're looking at NXT, all these people you have down at NXT, or these people working at the Performance Center, and they get selected to get called up. Genuinely speaking, you would think they would get called up because there's some sort of plan for them. And if there's some sort of plan for them, they're going to appear on a PLE in some form. Maybe it's only for one match, but usually it's for a couple if you have a plan for them. The outsiders, they have less invested in the sense of they haven't been paying this person for years and years to be training, and they haven't paid to educate them in wrestling. So there's less of an investment there. So there's probably less of a focus in there. There's also, if you look at the list of talents that we have here, without getting into a conversation about star power, which I'm sure is going to be coming, the people who are, pure or mixed, but especially like the pure WWE Performance Center recruits, probably look a certain way relative to the way that the outsiders look. And those are people that are like,
I bet
right.
I bet if what would be interesting is to gather up the average heights of the pure products and compare them to the average heights. I mean, Charlotte Flair alone is probably taller than AJ Styles, right?
Yeah. Well, just look at, like, let's look at the top 5 here. Yes. So Charlotte Flair, Braun Strowman, Baron Corbin, Alexa Bliss, and Miro all have, in different ways, like Vince archetype looks for who he wants to put on television, right? If you look at the top 5 on the other end, AJ Styles, Kevin Owens, Xavier Woods, Sami Zayn, and Asuka, all those guys don't. All the men are too small or too short. And Asuka isn't a former fitness model, to my knowledge, with implants. And so, like, that kind of, if you look at this, like, knowing who Vince likes and who Vince wants to put on television, this is how he's getting them, is because the indies aren't producing those people, or other non-WWE entities aren't producing that kind of talent, the kind of talent Vince McMahon wants to look at on television. WWE's had to create that talent himself. And you can pretty much look down this entire list of pure WWE wrestlers, with a few exceptions here or there. It's a lot of, on the men's side, former college football players or former college athletes, bodybuilders or some in that regard.
And there's one man defying expectations as usual, Dominic Mysterio.
Dominic Mysterio continues to stand out in that regard. Well, there's a few. There's like real one, Enzo, yes, on here, which I wouldn't say is like a typical Vince looking guy. But of course he was paired with Big Bill, who absolutely was.
Yes. And we do get Logan Paul here, who I would definitely classify as a celebrity, but he's had 5 PLE matches at this point somehow. And I'm sure more to come. So as a stand-in for star power, we'll look at Google Trends, right? And so maybe you would say, well, maybe the pure PC projects, they get to PLEs almost as efficiently as as likely as outside wrestlers, but maybe the bigger stars end up still being the people with real wrestling experience, and we'll see if that's true. And so what I've got here is the top who. So I figured the fairest way to do this was, if we're going to look at Google Trends, was to let's look at all these wrestlers, and let's look at their Google Trends, and let's take the year that they had the highest Google Trends average, and let's look at it that way, and then rank them that way. And the first one won't be particularly fair, but I bet she's still number one overall anyway, is Ronda Rousey, whose highest year for Google Trends was 2015, before she was ever in WWE. This was her biggest UFC year, where she was a really major mainstream personality. She's probably still above AJ Styles at number 2, even in her WWE days, I would think. But AJ Styles is number 2. When AJ Styles came to WWE in 2016, he immediately became, in the Google Trends measurement, became a pretty big getter of web searches, we could say.
A really impressive performance by a rookie too. Like,
yes,
his rookie year, 2016. And I think part of it with AJ Styles is also he had a surprise debut at the Royal Rumble, where a lot of people are watching, and they made a really big deal about it at the Royal Rumble. And so, although they didn't film it correctly, so I think that probably helped boost up his Google Trend number, right?
And he won the title in his first year, I believe, right?
Oh yeah, he had an amazing year that whole year, and he was there the whole year, which probably helped too.
And he got there right at the beginning of the year, yeah. Yeah,
it starts out with making this big, huge debut during an event where a lot of people who maybe don't normally watch WWE are watching it because it's the Royal Rumble, and they see this person who just comes out and everyone makes a big deal about them. That would lead, if I didn't know who AJ Styles was, I would certainly lead to me looking him up to find out more. Just given the
I think he was coming off a pretty hot run too from New Japan, and the Bullet Club at this point was a very popular stable, and I think like that kind of helped too when you bring an outsider and you put him straight to the main roster.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he has AJ Styles' debut in WWE is one of the best debuts of the last 10 years, probably, like as far as like as a moment of someone showing up.
Is he the last non-WWE, like other than like Logan Paul, to go right to the main roster?
I guess Ronda Rousey also.
Yeah.
I feel like there's been some.
I mean, Braun Strowman basically was not on. No, I don't believe was ever on NXT. There've been
Strowman was never on.
Yeah.
Strowman was never on television.
Was almost ever on NXT television before he went to the main roster.
Yeah, I'm trying to think as an outside signing.
But I'm trying to think of people with like experience and stuff like that. Like
Cody in a way,
but he was WWE before, so
right.
Yeah.
Trying to think. I feel like there's been
I bring this conversation up because if Jay White does get signed by WWE, it'll be interesting to see what they do with him.
I'm sure if Jay White goes to WWE, I think they'll put him right on the main roster.
I think he's got to spend some time like knowing where the hard cam is personally.
Yeah, maybe working on a hip toss or two. My takeaway here, and then there are additional exceptions here, like Katana Chance, whose highest Google Trends numbers in 2014, I assume when she was on the Ninja Warrior. So there's some anomalies here, right, from non-wrestling activities.
Well, this list clearly, like, I think over skewers towards women relative to star power.
Yes, but my takeaway here is it doesn't tell me a story that says, hey, people from the outside do much better than people who have no experience when they come in.
Adam Berger for Voice of Wrestling did a very similar analysis and study, and he wrote it in an article that came out last year, where he breaks it down kind of similarly to the way you do, Brandon, between the outsider, pure and mixed, and he also looks at like pay-per-view PLE now, main events and title wins.
The correct terminology, yes.
And he kind of looks at that and seeing like who is actually getting pushed, because I think from a numbers standpoint, there are plenty of people that were trained at the Performance Center that are soaking up spots on the main roster in some form.
Yeah, counting up the days that one held a title was something else that came to mind, but it would have been more.
And that's also arbitrary. It's like, okay, so like WWE decided to push someone for a little bit.
That's not immune from self-fulfilling prophecy.
And gave them
none
a
of this
mid-card
is
title.
Wrestling. Yeah,
right. You could argue that is significantly less impactful. That like Vince McMahon decided to let this person be Intercontinental Champion for 100 days in a completely meaningless run is less relevant than like the Google Trends number. I think this data is skewing the influence of women way too much, in the sense that like Lana is fifth, well ahead of Kevin Owens. But who is a bigger star within wrestling terms? It's obviously Kevin Owens. In the Performance Center, I think if we're going to talk about success from the Performance Center, it's definitely the women's division has had a lot more success than I think the men's division when it comes to actually creating stars, especially if you factor in some of these people who are labeled as mixed, like Becky Lynch and Rhea Ripley and Bayley, and those are your biggest stars.
Mm-hmm. And Liv Morgan is up here too, and Alexa Bliss, who have become, they've definitely been used a lot on TV, been featured.
Right, and I think when you want to have a discussion about like when we talk about the big question, which is like, is the Performance Center a success? Is the Performance Center successful at what it does? And a lot of it's going to depend on what you consider to be a success. And I think what WWE internally, in a lot of ways, considers success is maybe different than what like me or a hardcore fan would determine as a success. I think they would look at someone like Omos and say that he's a big success. They signed him, out of college with no wrestling experience. They trained him. They taught him how to wrestle, and now he's been on 17 pay-per-view events. Since he debuted, he's going to wrestle Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania. Clearly, he's a huge success. To me, as far as I would look at it more of like, it's almost like a real money drawing star is almost going to be like a major figure in WWE for 10 years. I would slide towards no, in that if Omos was not in the company, would the company be in any significantly worse shape than it is now? I would say no. So I don't really know how much real value he's bringing to the table, but WWE's view on things is perfectly valid, in the sense that if their goal is to find talent that has a certain look, train them, teach them the way of WWE, teach them how to look at the hard cam, and to get that person on television a lot, and to fill out your roster with people, men and women, that look like certain things and understand the WWE way, then it is certainly a success, because look at the number of people that are on the roster that have come from that background.
I think in the case of somebody like Omos, one of the things that he brings to the WWE is that he's from Nigeria, and you get to have this star who's from a region that has a huge population, and it's a region that you probably want to grow your fan base.
Mm-hmm.
And there's where else? I mean, on the indies or in some other wrestling company, it's going to be very hard to find somebody who has that origin. So, I think that's
true. I mean,
that's something.
They have Kofi Kingston, who's from Ghana, but yes, I mean, and like when I was reading Cameron Hawkins' article on the NIL deal, right? He was, like I said, this is on The Ringer, and he had this article where he went to a dinner with all these college athletes, and they had, I think, 3 WWE wrestlers that spoke. One was Bianca Belair, who's obviously a college athlete. One was Big E, who's not a Performance Center trainee. He predates that, but was also a college athlete signed by WWE. And the other one was Omos. And it's like, I don't think anyone would dispute that Big E and Bianca are good representations of the WWE Performance Center. I think it's Omos really good representation, because he's not a very good wrestler and is very limited in what he can do. But you can probably have him at these kind of dinners and things, and you can see he has a certain type of physical presence, similar to what Paul White and Great Khali had, in the sense that he certainly passes the airport test. Mm-hmm. And you can have them at public relation things like this, and be able to relate to people in that way. But I think I'm just using him as an example, but you could point to other people on this list and be like, okay, is Otis really feel like he's like a success from the Performance Center? Like, to me as a wrestling fan, like, I could take or leave Otis. I don't need him on my television. I think he has a very limited amount of appeal to exist as a drawing card, but he's someone WWE signed from scratch, trained him, taught him the way of WWE, and now he's been on a certain number of pay-per-view events. I think he's probably won the tag titles, I think, before.
Well, and he was hot at one point too, doing that whole
Yeah, he was
storyline.
part of at least a somewhat memorable angle with the Mandy Rose angle and things like that. To me, I'm not looking at Otis as like a model of success if I'm the Performance Center, but in WWE terms, he is successful. The big question I think I have about the Performance Center, and I think what most people have from Performance Center, is that, especially on the male side of the roster, they don't seem like they're capable of producing a real wrestler who understands how to connect with audiences in a really strong way to the point that they could be a main eventer. Um, and you look at people who are at the top of this list on the outsider category, people like AJ Styles, Kevin Owens, certainly Sami Zayn recently. It doesn't seem like the Performance Center is churning out people like that, despite the number of people that the Performance Center has trained over the last 10 years, and despite the fact that the Performance Center has trained a lot of the people that Vince McMahon thinks should connect with the audience in that way and has not.
I guess if we look at this, the blue pure side, who are the most promising wrestlers here that could be main eventers here? I mean, at the top we have Braun Strowman, and Braun Strowman has turned into a fairly big star for them. Baron Corbin, I think, is a pretty contentious figure in wrestling fandom, whether you think he has value or not, and how much. But I guess Montez Ford is somebody with the biggest upside that stands out here.
Yeah.
I mean, Montez Ford, I think, has a lot of potential. A lot of these guys on this list have a lot of potential. When will WWE seize that potential is another question. That's more of booking as opposed to raw talent.
Mm-hmm.
But yes.
And a lot of these people, and remember, we ruled out anybody whose first match was not more than 9 months ago. So we don't have Braun Breaker on here, for example. I don't think. But some people just aren't with the company anymore, I guess, which will bring us to our next point here, where I'm going to put on my cynical WWE hat. And like, is there a justification, like a defensive justification, why you don't want to invest too much in people who have wrestling experience? Because if you invest in people who have wrestling experience, maybe you're just giving exposure to people who you're gonna shine this incredibly powerful W spotlight on them, elevate them through your enormously powerful distribution platforms, and then maybe they're gonna work for you for 3 years and then go somewhere else and help your competitors. And to answer whether that's actually more the case for people who have wrestling experience before WWE than it is for people who don't, I looked at the people from this group of wrestlers and asked, well, where are they now among the people who are no longer with WWE? And in the pure category, we have 13 out of the 32. So 41% are no longer with WWE from the pure projects. 8 of those 32 are actually wrestling elsewhere. And I guess there's so few of them, we'll just name them. And that is Miro, that is Big Bill, W. Morrissey, Colin Cassidy. That is Enzo Amore, Real One, who's with MLW. Miro is with AEW when he is appearing on TV. Aiden English is with Impact as an announcer, right?
Yeah.
Levi Cooper is apparently taking indie bookings, according to Cage Match. And we have AOP, Occam and Razor, who are taking at least some bookings. Maybe
Have they? I don't know if they've wrestled a match though.
They were definitely advertised for that big UK show that never.
Well, they
happened.
were running it. The NFT funded big UK show, but I don't think they've actually had a match.
And aren't there reports that they're maybe going to come back to WWE? So I suppose definitely, yeah. Few of them are wrestling, and we could adjust this and say, well, maybe AOP don't belong there, and that would bring us down to 6 of 32, which would be substantially less than a quarter.
And it's also, I mean, part of it also comes down to star power in the sense that, like, if you're still wrestling elsewhere, some of the people you can point to that, like people like Miro, obviously, or people like even Bill Morrissey or Enzo, like, they had legitimate kind of like they got legitimate cracks at being stars in WWE and got over to a degree. like Miro worked main events in WWE and stuff like that. So they're obviously they can make more money outside of WWE because they have more star power and more credibility, as opposed to some of these people whose options for if they want to work outside of WWE is probably not going to be super lucrative, and it's probably not going to be in any form of glamorous venue, as opposed to Miro, who goes to AEW and works in a major professional wrestling organization.
And so let's look at the other categories and see how much those people are in other wrestling companies. We've got 22 of the 54. So 41% are no longer with WWE. So still a majority with WWE. And 20 of them, 37% of them are wrestling elsewhere. And some of them did wrestle elsewhere. So I guess Brody Lee unfortunately has passed away, but he was with AEW. But Samoa Joe, Saraya, Samurai Del Sol, the former Kalisto, Ruby Soho, and the list goes on, right? So we don't need to name them all. But we do have a greater percentage, right, are wrestling elsewhere. Even if we accept this 25% for the pure projects, we've still got, 37%. More of them are wrestling elsewhere. And in the mixed category, the percentage is actually a little bit higher.
I expected that too, yeah.
Yeah, for only 17 wrestlers, 8 out of the 17 are no longer with WWE, and 7 of those are wrestling elsewhere. Mercedes Moné, Eric Redbeard, Buddy Matthews, Tyler Breeze, Peyton Royce is not wrestling. She is the one who is not with WWE but is not wrestling elsewhere. And then we got Dax Harwood, Connor O'Brien, and is James Ellsworth still taking bookings? Well, there he is. So there's that.
And Peyton Royce, she worked Impact, right?
Yes, that's true.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. This is at this moment, so that's a good point.
And I think she just have a baby?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So even then, that she could very well return to pro wrestling outside of that window.
Yeah. So I guess with that in mind, maybe there's some defensive value. I guess there's some, right? And that was definitely my perception of Vince's mentality, was that he wanted to, maybe for reasons beyond this, wanted to bring in people who had a blank slate, who could take whose credit could be credited to no one but WWE, no one but Vince for creating them. And then maybe that there is some defensive value in that people who you got from a blank slate and you created them from scratch, they wouldn't have value. They wouldn't have this pre-existing relationship or recognition outside of WWE, and maybe they wouldn't go elsewhere to help your potential competitors who you pretend don't exist.
Yeah, I mean, Triple H told The Athletic, I think in an article that came out last year talking about the Performance Center, that they didn't necessarily like signing a bunch of indie talent because those people knew how to wrestle a different way, and they had to teach those people
different playbook.
Right, they had to, but they had
Bad
to,
habits.
they had to teach them. They had to make them unlearn some of their bad habits they established, and they could learn the proper WWE way. I mean, nobody likes signing indie talent more than Triple H. So I don't know how much he really believes that, but in the sense of WWE pivoting away from as indie focused of a strategy,
that's something that he said over the years. I very remember when he started doing the media calls, him saying that in 2014, really just before he started to sign a lot more wrestlers with wrestling experience. It's hard to teach people your new playbook. We feel like we have this playbook that's the best playbook for us. And when you come to a new team, you gotta run our playbook. You can't run the playbook that you're used to wrestling. And sometimes you sign these people up who've been running the same playbook for 8-10 years, and it's hard to teach them the new playbook.
The man loves his football analogies.
Is he a big football fan?
He uses it a lot when he answers. He uses it a lot. Like, he uses football coaching analogies a lot when it comes to, I feel like, answering questions like this. When he talks about playbooks and he talks about, we've got a new assistant coach. I'm the head coach. They're the play caller. Like, you'd think he's Jim Ross sometimes with his number of football analogies when it comes.
Well, it's the most popular sport in the United States, so he's just trying to,
I know he's supposedly a West Ham United fan. I'm pretty sure it's
soccer?
because. Yeah, but their logo, Brandon, is a big sledgehammer.
Oh,
so
wow.
2 big sledgehammers actually. So
Yeah.
I think that's why he probably chose them.
So I guess my question is, and partly this whole thing was sprung on by like, I was asked a while ago about how can WWE improve, and I was kind of like at a loss for for things that were obvious to me, and after thinking about it for like 10 minutes, I guess talent development is a big question to me in WWE. Like where, and I think it's something we've talked about before on this podcast, is that who are the next big stars for WWE? Let's say in NXT, is it Braun Breaker? Maybe. Are there others? There isn't a clear class of talent that I could see who are in NXT now, who are going to be main eventers. Let's say 5 years from now.
This might be hard to find the data, but it'd be interesting to find out like how many wrestlers they've signed since the Performance Center opened and how many have been released in that 10 years, and see that comparison, like how many are, so. Because they've released a lot of wrestlers.
You want to do that? You could look that up. You want to look that up?
Yeah,
Not
I mean,
right now, but
you'd have to go back and dig through a lot of like press releases and announcements of people that they signed to deals, because you would probably hear their name in a press release and then never hear about them ever again.
Right. If you look through the class pictures, I think that would be the thing to do.
But yeah, you can see like you get the press release and it's like, yeah, we signed so and so, a 6'4", 310-pound guy who was last an offensive guard for Tulsa University football or something like that.
And it's worth mentioning, so with the NIL program, Paul Levesque did mention on the previous earnings call that some of those wrestlers are just about ready to make their TV debut. And to my knowledge, none of them yet have made their debut. And there's more than 40 of them that they've signed.
Again,
and the program is almost a year. It's just over a year old.
I want to say, I should probably pull it up at this point, but the Cameron Hawkins article, I think he mentions that there are a couple people who recently debuted on NXT that are maybe NIL signings.
Maybe on Level Up, probably.
Yeah, I'm going to actually look that up now. But
do they count Gable Steveson, though? Because I know he's not wrestling.
Has he had a match, though?
He hasn't a match, He's been on TV, but hasn't had a match yet.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think when it comes to like star power, I mean, I think a lot is being put on Braun Breaker at the moment because he's clearly like the person in NXT that they're pushing as a main eventer. I think if we're just looking at things right now in the moment, it's kind of a difficult time to assess because, probably like a year or 18 months ago, WWE went through this huge overhaul of what NXT was and what they were going to look for. And they released Triple H lost power, Vince released a bunch of people that Triple H maybe had eyes on as becoming main event stars, most of them indie wrestlers or former wrestlers who had experience outside of WWE. So if you're looking at things now, like, okay, who are the stars of the future in WWE? It is hard to determine because you're basically looking at talent that has only been wrestling for maybe a year, maybe a little bit more, but maybe a little bit less as well. And it's hard to say just if you have a bunch of talent that's only 1 year into their wrestling career and has had a limited number of television matches. It's hard to identify their real potential and hard to see them, as a major star. Breaker's really the only one that I think they've made a real sincere effort at trying to push as a major star. And even he has a lot of question marks because, again, he's only wrestled for about a year now. So it's hard to look at things now and say, like, okay, who are going to be the stars in 4 or 5 years? They might be able to develop a lot of these new talents into main event stars, and they can replace not only Roman Reigns, but replace Seth Rollins, replace Kevin Owens, replace Cody, replace Sami Zayn, replace these other, not just the very top guy, but also these credible main eventers that WWE has built up over the last decade. And I don't know if that we have 10 years of evidence of the Performance Center, especially on the male side of the roster, really no one that's really been able to succeed at the level that, say, like a Seth Rollins has as a WWE star, but maybe just, with less competition from experienced indie workers, which is a real thing in the sense that you are no longer, if you change your philosophy like in NXT, that you no longer are competing with veterans who have 10 times more experience than you do if you're a Performance Center recruit. That makes a difference. I think that was the thing with like NXT. You would watch the NXT TakeOver shows and they were great, but there weren't developmental shows because there'd be like maybe one person on the show who was a Performance Center recruit and everyone else was a veteran wrestler by the time WWE signed them. So I think it's kind of an awkward time for WWE right now when it comes to picking out stars of the future, and it's totally to their own doing. It's because they've been bad at doing it for the last 5 years. But because they had that reset about a year ago, it seems difficult to kind of assess where they're going to be in a few years when it comes to talent that comes across as main event stars.
Well, we have a new factor too, and that's AEW talent, right? Because young AEW talent that are getting TV time, they're going to be free agents eventually, like a Ricky Starks, an MJF, a Daniel Garcia, a Wardlow. Now you're talking guys that could possibly go from AEW to WWE as main eventers and push more Performance Center NXT guys out of the picture. Because I mean, I assume WWE is going to bid for some of these young talent when they become available, and those talent are going to want to go right to the main roster, I assume.
And Gullo, I think you're starting to answer a question that I want to state
Yeah.
here. So number one, is this, we've tried to evaluate the results of the WWE Performance Center, which has existed for 10 years. Is what they're doing the most efficient and effective way to develop marketable talent? And if not, what is? What would be a better way?
I mean, obviously, sign some of these AEW talent, and and now Ring of Honor is going to build more talent up. I mean, Impact and MLW have young stars.
Yeah. So I think if you look at how the NFL and the NBA and other major sports develop their talent, they don't cook them up in an NFL performance center. They don't cook them up in an NBA performance center. They rely on college sports. They rely on a younger other organization called the NCAA to provide their talent, and they draft them from that. And sports are not a perfect analogy for pro wrestling, because I think in a lot of ways pro wrestling ends up overlapping spaces between sports and non-sports forms of entertainment. But I think there's a compulsion from Vince's leadership, which hopefully will be further removed as time goes on, of having to control this world that you're getting your talent from. But the NFL somehow still survives despite the NCAA existing as an independent organization with which a bunch of other teams, and they even make a lot of money doing it. And same for other versions of the NCAA basketball and things like that. So I think the NIL program is one way to recruit talent, and I wouldn't necessarily say don't do that, but I think the way to recruit talent is to do the NIL thing, do tryouts with people who have no wrestling experience, but I think to recruit wrestlers as well from other wrestling organizations, and maybe rather than do we have Triple H's here, global localization, which is a plan that he rolled out in 2018, and they've certainly given signals that they're interested in continuing to execute on that plan of putting NXT performance centers and NXT brands on different continents of the world, which sounds like a very expensive strategy to me. I would suggest, rather than doing that, then do something you might call global subsidization, where you don't acquire other wrestling companies, which is also something that they've talked about. Stephanie mentioned that at the Wells Fargo conference a few months ago. But where you don't spend money on buying wrestling companies, you don't spend money on building new performance centers and staffing them, and running NXT live events and things like we think they're going to do with NXT Europe, where they've put NXT UK on pause, or they dismantled it, and they're going to supposedly relaunch NXT Europe maybe sometime later this year, which again sounds very expensive. Plus, it brings the problem of you have this sort of centralized talent development leadership, which results in homogenous wrestling philosophy that I don't think has been proven to be highly successful, and that I think over the course of wrestling history, one of the factors that has helped develop a wide range of valuable wrestling talent is the fact that it did develop organically, whether that was through the territory system decades ago, whether that was through this sort of hybrid of independent/international ecosystem that developed much of the talent over the last 10 years or so, which came at virtually no cost to WWE. So I think the thing to do is, rather than spending money on performance centers and NXT brands internationally, would be to identify and subsidize, partner with other wrestling companies that you don't control. Scary thought, but that you don't control, and help those companies exist, and maybe even let your talent work there occasionally. Sort of like send people on excursion, and have those wrestlers experience other experiences in other countries with other wrestlers, which has proven to make so many other wrestlers throughout the course of history better.
I think, so first, I just want to mention that according to this article by Cameron Hawkins, which has, this is a quote directly from the recently fired James Kimball, but Tank Ledger and Oba Femi, who are both recent NXT level up wrestlers, were part of the first NIL class. So there are people that signed to NIL deals who have at least appeared on WWE programming so far. Mm-hmm. But to get back to your point, Brandon, I've always thought that like the NIL in particular is like a marketing PR thing more than it is an actual talent development thing. I'm sure in WWE's mind, their idea is we're going to take this talent and we're going to make them big stars and we're going to train them. But I also think like the NIL is all, which technically through NIL, which is using new NCAA regulations that allow WWE to sponsor active NCAA athletes. That is a new thing. But in the articles, the NIL philosophy is always, these mainstream media articles that write these articles on WWE's NIL thing. It's always marketed almost as like this new thing. Like WWE they're looking at college athletes now, and they're going to a college, NCAA football player and saying, hey, you're probably not going to make the NFL, but we think you might be a good fit in wrestling. Try being a wrestler, as if that's something that is new to pro wrestling, as opposed to something that wrestling promotions have been doing for decades. I also think it goes to kind of what your point was, Brandon, which is it shows the idea of the Performance Center and the idea of getting athletes from college and training them to wrestle. It also shows WWE investors that WWE has control over the future of its product. If you're relying constantly on the independents or AEW or New Japan Pro Wrestling to develop talent for you, then you don't have control over your product because you're relying on a third party to develop the stars that you are then going to rely on to drive business forward. If you really sell the idea that you are training all of these people yourself and that WWE is, vertically integrated with its entire talent development system and taking someone from, Raw former college athlete into Wrestlemania main eventer, that's a way better sell to people who want to get on the strength of your company than it is to say like, yeah, we pick up talent from all over the place and we're relying on these independent promotions to develop talent, and then we take them and make them WWE stars. It's way better from an investment perspective to show that WWE has control over the long-term stars it has. It's how they've answered every single question during these investors calls over the last decade. When people ask about who's going to be the next John Cena, what's going to happen with the next star, and they always say, we've got the Performance Center. We've got plenty of stars coming. It takes time, but don't worry, they're coming. I would say the results have been mixed, over the last 10 years, but I do think the reason that it's sold a lot is more based on the idea to show people that WWE has control and is WWE is being innovative when it comes to creating its own stars as opposed to relying on others.
And I should add, too, we should be upfront here. I should have been upfront at the beginning that I am an active independent wrestler who may have a bias and agenda here, but it occurs to me, especially around the point that Jesse, you were making, that I don't disagree with, especially with the male talent. You don't have a lot of wrestlers who you trained from scratch who have become excellent in-ring performers, or even not that many who've become especially marketable talents, period. And now it's been 10 years, and knowing no better, you would think that, hey, WWE has all the resources in the world. They have all the money that you would need to run a great wrestling school. They have access to all the staff and trainers and coaches who you'd want to help you run a great wrestling school. Yet,
before WWE, it was a a wrestling ring in someone's garage, and that was how people were trained. And now they have this big multi-million-dollar facility with all of these veteran coaches. And look, it's Shawn Michaels, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. He's in charge of running things. It's all very impressive to the media and for people who maybe aren't looking as closely at the results of this place, I think. And that's what makes it a successful marketing strategy.
And obviously, I've never visited the Performance Center, but 10 years with the output that they've had is this disappointing to me. I would be disappointed if I were in charge of the Performance Center and we put this, what I have to imagine is tens and tens of millions of dollars into this facility, and 10 years, and we have virtually unlimited resources, at least on the scale of any other wrestling school. And yet the talent output hasn't been super impressive to me. It would suggest to me that there's some sort of more fundamental issue happening with their training process.
Yeah, and or just how what they think of as is important to being a star. We've talked about this before, but wrestling is an art form. Wrestling is about, and if you look at art, the most groundbreaking, exciting pieces of art are people that are attempting to do things that have never been done before, and people that are allowed to be creative and independent. And the way WWE's Performance Center seems to approach wrestling is very formulaic, which is this is the proper way to do everything. And they've got an assembly line process of men and women with great conventional looks for television that I would say a lot of like the Performance Center trainees have solid fundamentals as wrestlers. There's not a ton of people that they churn out that are like really bad wrestlers, especially on the male side. But a lot of it is the same. A lot of it is guys who look the same and act the same and talk the same. And that's never really going to be successful in the sense of pro wrestling.
And maybe there's like some just sort of, maybe this is a fact or a likelihood of human nature is that when you've got an organization that has accumulated such power within its field as WWE has, that maybe that place is not the best place to educate people on how to be a great artist, a great practitioner of the craft of pro wrestling, because power is not necessarily interested in advancing an art form. Power is interested in preserving and advancing its power.
Well, I have to say it goes to the male talent that they're signing in the pure category, right? Like these are football players, very tall guys, bodybuilders, people that probably maybe didn't even watch wrestling before. If you look at who are considered the best workers in the world, Bryan Danielson and AJ Styles and Jonathan Gresham, you talk about in-ring like technical workers. They were all wrestling fans, and they're short guys. It's not like WWE's going to sign a 5'10" amateur wrestler, and that guy might turn out to be a huge star, but that's not what they're signing. If we're in that pure no experience level,
right? And if you don't, I don't know. I find it hard to believe that somebody can be a major star in wrestling without a certain level of curiosity on how to be better, and a lot of that would come from watching other wrestling.
I mean, Batista was the last success of that, right? Like,
well, you could say like Roman Reigns, obviously.
Wrestling. Yeah, but Roman Reigns obviously knew wrestling.
Right. That's true. That he is that obviously is in his family. And a lot of the most successful Performance Center trainees, recruits, or WWE developed talent have been second or third generation wrestlers. For sure. I think to me the problem where I have with the Performance Center is I don't think it churns out wrestlers who, ironically, because this is allegedly what WWE does the best, I don't think they turn out wrestlers that have like a real character that are able to connect with audiences, and they don't have the kind of charisma that you need to have to be a major star in wrestling. They have the look, they might have solid in-ring fundamentals, but without that charisma and crowd connection, it's hard for them to really break out, especially given the way that WWE likes to tell its stories, which is very based on those two things. And a lot of it is, you look at NXT right now, it's like every wrestler there has some sort of wacky character that's either a job or a hobby. Like they have the girl now that's a big streamer, and they have they're all given this character, but none of them feel real. None of them feel realistic. And I think like someone like Sami Zayn, who's managed to become a huge success in WWE recently, is largely done so because his character feels real and he's able to connect with the audience emotionally. And I don't see a lot of the model Performance Center people able to do that.
So the final point that I would want to make, besides maybe there's some issues with the self-produced wrestling developmental environment, is if I were WWE, I would want to fix my developmental system for one thing. How, and in whatever ways we try to have a discussion about that in the last several minutes, but also be really open and willing and almost, I guess explicitly so, to recruit wrestling talent from all these other wrestling companies, whether that's in Mexico, Japan, or the United States, and particularly to look at AEW as sort of a developmental system. The more that, and what's going on with Cody right now is an important strategic step towards that end. By that I mean position AEW as a number two, even more so by taking people who come out of AEW and then have bigger careers in WWE, where if Cody, let's say Cody beats Roman Reigns at WrestleMania, he has this great moment, and then you do continuous iterations, not necessarily saying they have to main event WrestleMania and win the title there, but continue to create the perception that this is maybe where people start their careers, and they take a stepping, they use AEW as a stepping stone to get to the really, really big show, which in terms of media distribution and money is pretty much undeniable, right? And this is where people really advance. People get some traction here in AEW, or even maybe it's Jay White coming out of New Japan, or it's others coming out of CMLL or AAA, and this is where their career really blasts off and they become the biggest wrestling stars in the world.
To agree with you on that, Brandon, I mean, look at the 90s. Other than The Rock, the biggest stars in WWE in the late 90s Attitude Era were all from WCW. Triple H, Mick Foley, Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Yeah,
I mean, The Undertaker, too.
The flow of talent in the two big wrestling war periods that we've lived through have been very telling about where the momentum is going, right? When WCW was on the rise, a lot of talent was moving from WF to WCW. When WCW was on the downfall, a lot of talent was moving from WCW to WWF.
Trivia time.
Okay.
Throughout Roman Reigns' very long title reign, he has had 27 televised title defenses. Most of them on pay-per-views events, but a few were on episodes of SmackDown. How many of those defenses were against a wrestler trained by the Performance Center?
I'll say zero, probably.
By what definition?
Yeah.
Let's say anyone who would.
But
would
by
our
definition of pure here, yeah.
Yeah, pure or mixed.
Can I pull up the? Would it be cheating if I look at the sheet?
Yes, it would be cheating.
Okay,
because you could easily go through them.
I'm just going to say zero.
Yeah, it might be zero because I'm struggling to think. I mean, Matt Riddle comes to mind.
But he wouldn't be mixed. He would be.
Oh, I think he does classify as mixed.
Does he?
Matt Riddle.
Because then only Austin Fury.
Matt Riddle definitely had 100.
I thought he was on mixed as you're on the list. No.
I'm going to cheat if I look, but I'm pretty sure he's.
No, on your list. I thought he was down as mixed.
Matt Riddle is. No, he's an outsider. He's got a lot of matches.
Evolve was running a lot.
I agree that I would not count him as I would count him as an outsider. I don't know. He might be under 100 matches though.
He's an outsider. Yeah.
Anyway, the answer is 2. So there was a match against Braun Strowman on an episode of SmackDown. That was his second title defense. That was back in 2020, and then obviously Logan Paul at Crown Jewel.
Okay.
So
I think Logan Paul is an interesting case. I think worth spending a minute or two on too. In comments that Shawn Michaels has made publicly, I think in media calls about how they trained him. In that certainly WWE would want to tell you in public comments that Logan Paul has done an amazing job, and my God, he had a really cool match with Roman Reigns in Saudi Arabia, and wow, that video of him jumping off the top rope to the outside. And Shawn Michaels has talked about how they trained him, and that they trained him backwards, I believe is the terminology used. They trained him backwards, and they taught him how to do big stuff for this main event pay-per-view match. And how, oh yeah, lately we've been trying to teach him the fundamentals to put it all together. I think it tells you something about what it takes to be a really valuable wrestler, in that I would never tell anybody that fundamentals aren't important. And that's how we trained people on the fundamentals first before they were ever allowed to do anything else. But there's sort of this lie that's protected in wrestling. And it's not about how the businesses work, but this lie that's protected in wrestling about how you have to do things a certain way. And if you don't do things a certain way, you're wrong, you're bad, and everything's bad. And what they've done with Logan Paul really undermines the truth of what I think is the common wisdom that everybody's supposed to blindly accept and not question in wrestling generally. And this is true beyond WWE, if you know what I mean there.
I think like WWE's main event style, particularly Roman Reigns' main event style, is like super spot based. So if you just focus on doing like 4 or 5 spots over and over again, you could look competent in those matches.
The right and correct thing to do is whatever a power honors and whatever the experienced, respected vets say is good.
So you're talking philosophically.
Never think for yourself, or like even economically. What gets over? What gets over is what gets over.
I mean, so like for Logan Paul and Pat McAfee too,
and this goes to your Young Bucks point that you bring up sometimes about what they said in their book about. They just started to do everything that people told them not to do, and they got more over for doing it.
Yes, the Young Bucks started taking off when they realized that like
people. It's not advice that I would give to everybody to follow, but that worked for them.
Well, right. The Young Bucks say like people would tell them don't do so many high spots, and then they noticed that high spots were getting over, so they just started doing more of them.
Stop doing so many super kicks.
Yeah, and then what happened? They did more super kicks, and they got over. I think. Look, with McAfee and Logan Paul, what really stands out to me as far as just comparing them to your like typical WWE Performance Center recruit is not necessarily their ring work, which has been very impressive given their limited experience, but more of just like their charisma and personality. And they're people who are coming from backgrounds outside of wrestling, but are used to performing on a stage, for lack of a better term, and how that translates into them feeling very charismatic and over, as opposed to, not to pick on him, but like Madcap Moss, who feels like he's just this guy playing this weird character on television, and he looks at the hard camera and he makes faces, kind of like what WWE wants their talent to learn how to do, as opposed to people coming from outside who just immediately outshine WWE trained talent when it comes to getting a character over and being charismatic and feeling like a real alive person. I think that's really telling.
Yeah. Okay. We were short on topics, and I think we're finally finished the WPC topic. That was worried was not going to be enough for this program today, but we're past an hour and a half.
Yeah, this topic alone was over an hour.
Yeah. Finally, Keiji Muto, after his how many retirement shows did he have in this big tour? 12 of them or so. Keiji Muto finally did have his final match on the 21st. What day of the week was that? That was Tuesday at the Tokyo Dome in a show ran by Pro Wrestling Noah. He wrestled Tetsuya Naito, and then he had one more match with Masahiro Chono. Masahiro Chono slapping on the STF and tapping out Keiji Muto. This Tokyo Dome show for Noah had an announced attendance of 30,096, which is the biggest attendance since January 4th, 2020, Wrestle Kingdom 14, Night 1. They also had a second show, Night 2, which did almost the same number as this is announced as. So this was one of the biggest shows in Japan in years.
It was the biggest since the pandemic.
Right, yeah. And I understand this did very well on pay-per-view as well. I don't know if we'll ever get like some real concrete numbers on that, but this was not a show that you could just watch on a streaming service that you pay a monthly fee for. I understand, right? This is not part of Wrestle Universe.
I don't think it was.
Yeah.
It was it's very interesting as far as like the star power that Keiji Muto has, and how interest in his retirement match was able to draw this kind of crowd for Pro Wrestling Noah, which isn't doing really gigantic crowds, and I know shows that don't have Muto on them have done pretty poorly. I think they might have done a show that had like 800 fans at Corcoran Hall.
And real quick, how far back would you? I don't have the answer. How far back would you have to go to find a non-New Japan show in Japan that drew more than this show? If we assume that this 30,000 is close to the real figure, would we have to go back to 2005 Noah Tokyo Dome show?
I think you would have to go back to the major Noah shows. I can't remember what order. I want to say Noah Destiny, in 2005, which had the final big Misawa Kawada match. There was also like, I want to say Noah Grand Voyage, which maybe was a year before in the Tokyo Dome. But yeah, you'd have to go back almost 20 years, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that one was announced 2005 July. Tokyo Dome show by Noah was announced at 62,000. I'm sure that number is not real.
Those are the fake Tokyo Dome numbers, but a sellout.
But it may have been over 30,000.
Yeah. So huge success, but it also goes to speak about the kind of mainstream fan appeal that Keiji Muto and his generation of professional wrestlers had in Japan, compared to even people like Tanahashi and Okada, who I think we all recognize as major, successful, huge stars and excellent professional wrestlers. But that era of wrestling in Japan in the 90s and how big of a star Keiji Muto was in Japan, it's kind of uncomparable to wrestlers today. It's not dissimilar to like Stone Cold and Steve Austin versus like John Cena or certainly Roman Reigns, and that everyone there is a big star, but there's just a certain level of difference between the kind of mainstream appeal that a wrestler like Keiji Muto had.
And by the way, some of the biggest shows in Japanese wrestling history have been retirement shows, whether we're talking about the Inoki show in '98 at the Tokyo Dome and Choshu's retirement, which was, what year was that? I don't know.
Well, which Choshu retirement?
Well, the one in the Tokyo Dome with New Japan. Those are two of the biggest shows in wrestling history, is certainly in Japanese wrestling history.
Right, and this was, and Muto's really the last guy from that era of pro wrestling that could do a retirement show like this.
And Kobashi had a retirement that was at Budokan,
which did very well for Budokan Hall. But and maybe
I could see a Tanahashi having a big send off like this.
Right, Tanahashi, but like an independent of like Wrestle Kingdom, I could see Tanahashi having like a Wrestle Kingdom match. That's his last big match. But I also think Tanahashi's never going to retire, which is another thing. And maybe Muto is not really retiring, but that's also part of like the finality of it, in the sense that a lot of wrestlers maybe could have had this, but they didn't retire at the right time or whatever. They kind of just kept wrestling. Like Muto's kind of feels like the last major star of his generation that hasn't retired, but people like Tatsumi Fujinami, who are much older than Muto, are still wrestling.
Still going.
But I don't know if a Fujinami retirement...
That's what I was going to bring up, yeah.
I don't know if a Fujinami retirement match would be like...
At this stage, I think.
At this big deal. Maybe it would be, but I don't know enough about the Japan market and kind of like how big a name Fujinami is as an active wrestler. But he's, he pops up on like preliminary tag matches and on certain shows. I think he wrestled at Wrestle Kingdom this year.
I mean, look at Minoru Suzuki. When is he going to slow down?
Liger had his retirement. That was in 2020.
That was at Wrestle Kingdom, though, right?
Correct. Yeah. That was that January 4th. We should put the slide back. The January 4th, 2020 show, which is here.
The night
it
two,
is the most attended event in the last 4 years or so.
The thing about this Keiji Muto show is that it really was, in that 30,000 figure, it really was entirely built around Keiji Muto's retirement. This is not a promotion in Noah that could do any number close to this without this match as a headliner. It wasn't like an annual event the way Wrestle Kingdom is, where you'll sell a certain amount of tickets based on the name alone. There were other matches on the show. There were things like Okada versus Kiyomiya, which is a match between New Japan's world champion and Noah's world champion. But really, this was all about this Muto match. And just kind of like the celebrity status he has. I was listening to Wrestling Observer Radio from Friday, I want to say, maybe it was Saturday, and they were talking about like could this be done in the U.S.? Could like a Sting retirement match?
I
could
contrast it against like look at Ric Flair's retirement, which in a sense was a business wise was kind of a major success, right? I mean, it's pay per view. Who knows what it did, but yeah, it seems to have been a major success. And I mean, certainly they didn't put it in a stadium. I mean, maybe
would they draw like
bigger
7,000 fans for that? Maybe,
but it did very well for a non-WWE, non-AEW event.
Right, but part of it also is like the timing has to be right. Like Ric Flair already kind of had his retirement match at WrestleMania 24. Like people thought
Flair
that
had
was
many retirements.
Right. He had many before that. But as far as like the big final one, the one that had a sense of finality to it, I think a lot of people would point to that WrestleMania 24 match. And so now he's coming out and he's really old at this point, and people are, there's like people didn't know what kind of state physically he was going to be in during that match.
The number Cage match has in the database is 6,800 for Ric Flair's last match in July.
So that's one thing, but I think that like Muto's kind of coming in like Muto's physically was just totally washed up too at this point. But
he was active,
He is active. I don't think he had ever had a retirement match before.
Yeah, he was actively working, like not more than like Fujinami appearing up once in a while.
Yeah, he was actively working.
I think Fujinami did have a retirement match in 2003.
He probably did. I mean, I think all these guys probably.
I think he's been to that well.
Yeah, but I think with Muto, so the Muto is kind of like different in the sense that he's a real legend retiring, in a sense that people, at least this time, think that this is really the last time they're going to see him, as opposed to a lot of other people where it's like, this is probably not the last time we're going to see them, even though it's being labeled as a retirement match. And I think like in the U.S., like does WWE, and WWE to my knowledge has never done something like this, where they've had guys have retirement matches at WrestleMania, like Kurt Angle did a few years ago, and Ric Flair did at WrestleMania 24. But WWE has never tried to create like a stadium event based around one wrestler's retirement.
Match was not known to. What was Undertaker's last match? And
it was the AJ Styles cinematic match.
The filmed thing, cinematic. Yeah.
Was it? And there was no advertisement that would be his last match, right?
No, I think some people might have assumed it was going to be, but
because they were doing a documentary,
which would have been the first time that people assumed that was going to be Undertaker's last
he
match.
says he retires after every WrestleMania and then he comes back, but I mean Shawn Michaels, the career versus title match would be one, but that was part of WrestleMania.
Stipulation. These have been, whether it was Flair at WrestleMania, or it was Michaels at WrestleMania, those are stipulation matches, not like this is it no matter what.
Yeah, I think with and so like this would be something like, but to create an independent event and try to run a stadium show and run a special event, and there's nothing stopping WWE from doing this. They would just need to have the right big name talent willing to step away.
Cena's last match might do something good if they.
Yeah, and the reason we don't have a lot of these in wrestling is because most people don't want to retire for good. The wrestlers don't like that finality. When it comes to their retirement, and they like and especially big stars, they can always be lured out for one big match because it's usually very lucrative for them to do some, and a lot of them will crave the spotlight.
And really, Saudi Arabia has changed a lot of that, where we've seen Shawn Michaels come out of retirement for that match.
But I think like a WWE chose to do it. Like let's use Edge as an example. I'm not saying Edge has any plans to retire or anything like that, but Edge as a wrestler of some name value, who's obviously older and has probably talked about retirement at some point, was retired medically for a long time. But like, let's say Edge is like, I'm retiring in November. Like WWE could do like a long storyline building up to his final match, and they could maybe try to run. I don't know if they could run a full stadium, but maybe they could run they could sell out like a basketball arena in Toronto. They could sell out the it's not called the Air Canada Center, the Scotiabank Arena, in Toronto, built and do this big long build. They could do that, and they could have a special, a new PLE they can throw on Peacock. They could. That's something they could totally do, and it would probably be really good if you did it. I know Dave speculated that AEW could try something like Sting.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah,
right. Sting's the guy, right? Who has never had a retirement match. He does have, a generation spanning fan base. If you made a really, really big deal about it, you would get people who would want to fly into a Sting retirement show in Georgia. You could put it on pay-per-view if you wanted to.
Sting versus Darby is his last match or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could do something like that, and it would be cool. Like, I would like to see an independent event like that. I think the Muto event. I have no affinity for Muto at all, so like I wasn't really getting balled up in nostalgia for him during this final match. But it was a really impressive spectacle and a very, if you like Muto, it's a very heartwarming kind of fun event to watch. His final match, and they know his production is outstanding in that regard. So I think it'd be something that I would like to see in the US, just because I think it would be a really cool event. It could be a WWE event or an AEW event. Just has to be kind of the right talent and name.
Other majors, Junakiyama, I guess, but he wouldn't be as big as Muto, certainly.
No, that's it's just a different generation of star, basically.
Different level of star.
Is Akiyama ever gonna really retire? Akiyama seems like he's 10 years away from retiring.
Yeah.
Well, that's like Tanahashi. Tanahashi's what, 45?
Something like that.
Yeah. So Tanahashi's realistically 15 years away from retiring, barring terrible injury. Yeah. No, I'm serious. When it comes to in wrestling terms, how old are big stars? How old are they? What's the average age of the big star when they retire? It's, I don't know, mid-50s, maybe later.
Yeah.
Ric Flair, the last match, he just wrestled last year, and he's, 73, 74?
Yeah.
So we're a long way away from some of these names that are active now. Even guys like Tanahashi, who are clearly on the back nine of their career, from them actually having the definitive match. I mean, Keiji Muto stopped being a really big, what I would consider a really big star, main event star, 15 years ago.
Yuji Nagata. No, that would not be nearly as big.
He's never retiring.
Never. He's never aging, in fact.
Triple Crown champion, Yuji Nagata.
Yes. All right.
He's got to have that match with you, too. So
no, I don't know. It's going to take a lot for me to take.
If Yuji Nagata, promoters out there, if you can bring in Yuji Nagata, Brandon will come wrestle for you to wrestle Yuji Nagata. Just putting that out there.
I am not necessarily 100% open to it. So WrestleMania ticket update. They opened up some more seats behind the stage. They're going behind the stage. They're going Forbidden Door here. They're opening the Forbidden
Those tickets
seats.
better sell quick on the secondary market. Otherwise, those better have high prices on the secondary market. Otherwise, this event is going to be a failure.
Yes, this is. They're at, according to WrestleTix, WrestleMania Night 1 is at 54,000 at last count. 54,000 out for Night 1. 55,000 out for Night 2. I understand they made an announcement on SmackDown about some additional tickets being opened, and WrestleTix has pointed out here that some more tickets have been opened behind the stage. So there are still tickets left for WrestleMania.
Why are they opening up? I'm confused by the stadium configuration. Why are they opening up these tickets behind the stage when they have 54,000 tickets out? You would think that
they're sick of AEW diehards taunting them about not open up the back end of the stage.
But they should.
Bruno would sell this thing out.
But theoretically, they would have the the stadium's really big. I think we speculated probably even with the stage setup, it could probably sell 60,000 tickets, maybe. It seems like they would theoretically still have spots in the stadium that aren't behind the stage, which are kind of like your the last tickets to sell. That in the hard cam section.
I mean, I would think all of it is open except for this top level behind the and the lower levels behind the stage.
What is the what did they do? Do you have off the top of your head? Do you have the last year's WrestleMania attendance, Night 1 and Night 2?
I can look it up real quick. Why do you ask?
Just as a comparison between the two.
I want to say 65-ish, but I will give you the exact number in a moment. because one was slightly higher than the other. They were very, very close in number.
Yeah, I think like night one was a little bit bigger than night two.
Dallas AT&T Stadium, we had 64,513 according to WrestleTix, and night two, 65,653. So about 1,000 difference between the two.
Yeah, so that I don't know the difference in stadium. I imagine the stadiums have got to be of similar size.
Well, AT&T Stadium is the biggest NFL stadium, right?
Not really.
No.
It
It
was
could seat over 100,000.
It was originally the biggest NFL stadium from a seating capacity, based on kind of like a gimmick that they had to kind of announce that. But since then, it's one of the largest ones, but I do not believe it is the largest anymore. I want to say FedEx or MetLife Stadium is the biggest in NFL as terms of NFL seating.
According to a quick Google search, I get 80,000 for AT&T Stadium in Dallas, 70,000 for SoFi.
70 for SoFi, yeah.
That's football capacity, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All of this comes down to the number of suites they have.
Yeah.
And suites aren't being counted in all likelihood in this Ticketmaster count.
Mm-hmm.
They're building smaller stadiums too. I think the one in Las Vegas, Legion's like 65,000. Not like less.
Well, a lot of in stadium construction, and this is a big reason why part of this is this is a big reason why college football stadiums are bigger than NFL stadiums, is that NFL stadiums have a lot of suites and a lot of corporate areas and have a lot of space being taken up by those kind of things that are more lucrative than just having seats, as opposed to older stadiums and certainly like college stadiums where you just have these rows of bleachers where you can jam in way more people. And maybe a Los Angeles-based stadium has more room for corporate, seats like that than maybe a Dallas-based stadium. But I assume they're pretty. I guess my point is I'm curious to know, like, can we really compare the attendance between WrestleMania last year versus WrestleMania this year, and like use that as a fair barometer to look at, like, maybe some matches drew better, maybe some matches didn't draw as better. Was Steve Austin a big selling point for WrestleMania last year? How many more tickets can they sell for these two WrestleMania nights? Feels like,
according to
the company
about this being the biggest gate ever. I mean, it's above, at least according to them, it's above last year's gate.
Oh, I'm sure, because tickets are more expensive in Los Angeles.
Apparently,
and I assume the Los Angeles market alone is much more lucrative for them to run than Dallas. I'm curious to know, like, it feels like, like WWE's attendance for their, Raw and SmackDown shows are ahead of where they were last year.
Yeah.
And viewership and ratings seem to be doing pretty well. So it feels like in those barometers, WWE is a hotter company than they were at this time last year. Will that be reflected in WrestleMania attendance, or is the difference in stadiums just, it's hard to figure that out as far as if they can draw more or less than they did in Dallas? Seems like the Dallas stadium's a little bit bigger, so maybe, if they do 60,000 instead of 65,000, that's about equal. Yeah. Nick Khan said they're going to sell out both nights of WrestleMania. Again, what is a sellout? Is that just how many tickets you decide to distribute? But
right. I mean, and it's not as if I'm looking at Ticketmaster right now, which I can share. If I look at night one, I can still find $75 tickets. So it's not as if the tickets that are left are like platinum tickets that that cost hundreds of dollars. You can still get, what I imagine are middle of the road prices here.
And a lot of those, like
WrestleMania.
It says, like, if you look at where those are, a lot of those seem to be in those new sections that they just put on sale, right?
True. Yeah.
Like behind the stage. Which makes sense. The tickets that are available are going to be tickets that are not in optimal viewing locations, because all of the best seats have already been sold. It's going to be a hugely successful show. There's no other way to look at it other than that. And obviously, doing the 2 nights of WrestleMania has been a huge, huge success for WWE by pretty much every measure. Not only do you get the 2 gates, but you also get 2 nights of massive viewership for your events on Peacock, which I'm sure makes their partners there very happy. What do you think is going to main event the first night of WrestleMania, if we think that Cody Rhodes versus Sami Zayn is going to main event the second night? I'm sorry. Cody Rhodes versus Roman Reigns is going to main event the second night.
Yeah. Just looking real quick, and we do have official platinum. That's like, here's a upper half of the first level that is a platinum seat. That's $741. So maybe those new seats that have been open are almost the only reasonably priced tickets left. Maybe tag match will main event first night, Usos versus Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. If not that, then
Charlotte and Rhea Ripley.
then that, yeah.
Yeah.
You think that? So that would be. I mean, you can put anything in the main event.
And call it a
Realistically,
and
like the tickets are already sold, so
you could put Rick Boogs against Baron Corbin in the main event if you wanted to.
Right, you could do that, but I'm thinking more like
watch on Peacock,
if we're not talking about the main event, we're talking about like what is going to be the most heavily promoted match on WrestleMania night one. If we accept that there's only going to be one Roman Reigns match, and that's going to be the only world title match, and it's going to be on night 2 against Cody. I think the Usos versus Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens, when that match comes to fruition, is going to be the biggest match on the show outside of the world title match.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking it through, I guess.
No. Austin Theory, John Cena that's a rumored match.
That's true because of Cena's star power, similar to how Austin was the headliner on like.
I would think they want to put a women's match on top of one of these nights, and if it's going to be one of them, it's going to be the Charlotte Flair match with Rhea Ripley.
Right. I guess I'm saying like I don't consider that like the second biggest match for WrestleMania, as far as a selling point for people. So not necessarily so I guess like main event is not as really what I'm talking about, because main event is like a phrase, a marketing term you can use to say we had a women's main event again and a men's main event. I'm thinking more like what are they going to do to make sure that since tickets are already sold, like people are actually going to tune into WrestleMania night 1. To what's going to be the anchor of that show. I don't get the sense that Rhea Ripley versus Charlotte is a WrestleMania caliber headlining match, even if they choose to put it.
How do you confirm the answer to this question? What do you look at after the fact or leading up to the show?
I guess there's nothing you really can. I mean, you could look at Peacock viewing data, right? If they had that, but I'm sure they wouldn't release that in a way that we could easily digest.
No.
You can even make an argument for Logan Paul and Seth Rollins because Logan Paul's star power. See, I'm just starting to think of like other ways that can go.
I'm just trying to think like if I'm a WWE fan,
which you are.
Yes, of course, which I am, and I will definitely be watching both nights of WrestleMania live. Like, what is going to be like if let's say I'm like just a Peacock subscriber and maybe I watched the Royal Rumble, maybe I've dabbled with Raw or SmackDown a little bit, maybe I was into the Bloodline feud a little bit. What is going to get me to watch WrestleMania night 1? What's going to get me to be like, I can't do anything on Saturday night, guys. I've got to watch 4.5 hours of this wrestling show. What are the matches that are going to get me invested in watching it?
A historical perspective of the promoting career of Paul Bosch.
Now, see, if it was Paul Bosch's predecessor, Morris Siegel, I would be way into it. Okay. But I'm thinking like, obviously like Roman Reigns versus Cody, even though I think Sami Zayn should probably be in that match somehow. That feels like a big match. That does feel like, I think, going to be like a big motivating match for people to watch WrestleMania. And what is the other match that's going to do that? I think Cena's presence helps a lot. Obviously, we know he's a big mover of business. Did you note? I know there wasn't a slide. Did you see how many tickets John Cena sold for that Boston show?
We talked about it on Thursday in the Wrestlenomics 30. Yes.
So
yes,
John Cena's
moved over 2,000 tickets according to WrestleTix since he's been announced.
Yeah. So, and not even him like in a match or doing it. He's literally just going to be there.
Yeah.
I assume
That's
physically.
All he's got to do is show up.
Yeah. Maybe not even that. He could probably, if they just announced him and he was via Zoom, he'd probably sell a lot of tickets too. But maybe Cena. I think the Usos versus Sami Zayn match is probably the most momentous match that they have outside of the main event for the world title. So that's what I would put on as a kind of like the headlining act of night 1. But they don't have I don't think they're going to have Steve Austin this year. And Austin obviously I think helped a lot. Night 1 outdrew night 2 slightly. I know last year in Dallas, and a lot of that.
Well, he wasn't advertised in a match, but he was advertised.
Right, but everyone knew he was going to be there.
Yeah, and I probably assumed it was going to get physical in some.
Do you think Vince McMahon makes an appearance at WrestleMania this year?
No, I don't.
Right now,
is he in town? Do you think he's in town? I think is the harder question. Is he in LA?
I think he will be.
On April 1st.
My opinion, I might think I don't think he shows up on the pay-per-view now, but my opinion might change like a week before the show.
Is he in the venue? And would we know? I guess we would. That would.
We might be having a very
report.
different. I don't know anything, but people are hinting online a lot that there's a lot more smoke of him being back in creative, based on some. I think Sean Ross Sapp had a report that some wrestlers believe that Vince is back.
A talent reached out to Sean Ross Sapp, believing that.
But there's some other smoke.
Wade Keller reported that he was specifically told that Vince is not back.
Right. But what is back is also, I think, a key definition when we're talking about this. Like, is he backstage talking to everyone, and is he
take it
ripping
as
up
a
scripts?
minimum. He's not at TV.
He's not physically there.
He's not involved in creative meetings. Presumably, he's having conversations with Paul Levesque. Who knows how hands-on, how influential he's trying to be.
Dave has said that Vince was involved in the Sami Zayn Roman Reigns match from Elimination Chamber.
I was involved too. I was there.
Are you familiar with Vince McMahon's thinking?
Somewhat, but I've never met him, so I have watched him do things that have involved his thinking over the years, though. All right. Anything to plug before we go?
Yeah, the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. Big news for us. We're now going to be a member of the Voices of Wrestling Network. What does that mean for people? That means that our podcast will now be part of the network, which means you'll be able to access it anywhere where you get your podcasts. I know previously I always said it was on YouTube, and it will remain on YouTube. But now if you go on Spotify, if you go on Amazon, you go on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, look up Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. You can definitely check out. We have my most recent episode is uploaded already. That's a conversation I had with Rich Craich about the way we communicate about AEW and AEW discourse, and kind of the way people talk about AEW and what influences that.
Is this an every week podcast now?
It doesn't have a set schedule. In my mind, it's bi-weekly.
That wasn't part of the terms, the written contract?
It's bi-weekly. I mean, I can't disclose what's in the contract.
Okay. You're not going to get into the escalators and what the rights fee was?
I appreciate you asking, but I can't comment on that. I know you have to ask that stuff, Brandon.
I'll try to ask people familiar with the matter.
Yeah, if you could ask people that are familiar with my thinking, then perhaps you'll get it. But that's the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast, now part of the Voices of Wrestling Network, and I appreciate Rich and Joe for supporting the idea and backing it, and obviously support everyone who is listening to the show, which I know a lot of my listeners also listen to Wrestlenomics, which isn't a surprise, but anyone who's listened to the show and supported it since it started a few years ago. So thank you so much to everyone who's been a part of that.
Yeah, and Voice of Wrestling guys have been very supportive to Wrestlenomics over the years as well. So.
Yes, you guys are like a alumnus of the you guys are alumnus of the VOW network.
Yes. Okay, Gullo.
Just say, if you're in a Buffalo area, I'm going to be at Helium Comedy Club tonight, which is one of the premier comedy clubs in the Northeast. So,
are you the promoter? Are you in charge of that?
No, I'm not. I'm just just a performer. I do promote shows, but I do not promote them.
Will you be blading? Are you blading tonight?
Maybe. Who knows?
Have you thought about working blading into your act? I think maybe that would get crowd heat. That would get people involved.
Maybe there'll be a circle of fans that will really enjoy it and argue with people on Twitter who don't enjoy it. And
you can't do it too often, of course.
Yeah.
And I don't
the
think
deathmatch comedian Chris Gullo.
I don't think the commission will be there tonight either, so you could probably get away with it.
Possibly.
I have
seen people in New York try to have death matches at concerts. So.
Nice. Okay, great. Okay. Support your local deathmatch concert. We'll talk to you next time.